A racist police officer frames an innocent black man who gets 100 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He is shocked when the situation turns on him. The city's rush hour was winding down, and the streets had begun to clear as Malcolm Hayes drove his luxury sedan down the avenue. He'd been running late, his thoughts drifting to a quiet evening at home. But as he turned onto a side street, the glare of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror brought his mind to an abrupt halt. Malcolm felt a prickle of unease. He hadn't been speeding or broken any laws, and the street was empty, but for a few parked cars. He took a breath and pulled over, putting the car in park. Rolling down his window halfway, he waited, fingers drumming on the steering wheel, trying to push back a growing feeling of dread. The officer approached slowly, his gait confident, and Malcolm watched him in the side mirror, stocky, middle-aged, and looking at the car with a disdainful squint. "License and registration," the officer said, voice firm with a rough edge. Malcolm nodded, keeping his movements calm as he reached over to the glove compartment, pulling out his documents. He handed them to the officer, meeting his gaze. "Evening, officer. Was I speeding?" The officer took his time, glancing from the documents back to Malcolm, his expression unreadable. "Malcolm Hayes," he said slowly, his eyes trailing over the car's interior. "And what brings you here in a car like this?" Malcolm felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard that question before, the kind that wasn't really a question. "Just heading home after work," he replied, keeping his tone polite but guarded. The officer's gaze lingered, his mouth curving into a faint, smug smile. "Uh-huh. And what kind of work is that?" Malcolm kept his voice steady, but his patience was beginning to wear thin. "I own a tech company." "The documents are all there, officer. Is there something else you need?" The officer's brow arched, a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "A tech company. Impressive." He let the silence hang for a moment before chuckling under his breath. "Quite the car for a tech guy, don't you think?" Malcolm clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice respectful but firm. The officer shrugged, folding his arms. "Funny thing about problems, Mr. Hayes. They tend to find people who think they're above following orders." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, I've complied with everything you've asked. I'd just like to know if there's a reason for this stop." A spark of irritation flickered in the officer's eyes. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if savoring the tension. "Oh, there's a reason," he replied, his tone hardening. "I want you to step out of the car, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm stiffened, meeting the officer's gaze. "I don't see any cause for that, officer. I've given you my license and registration, and I'm complying with every legal requirement." The officer leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper. "You think you get to decide what's necessary here? I'm giving you a direct order. Step out of the car." Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he shook his head. "I've done nothing wrong," he replied firmly. "I'm staying in my vehicle, as I have every right to do." The officer's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He looked over Malcolm's shoulder, down the empty street, as if confirming they were alone. Then he let out a cold chuckle. "You must think you're real clever, don't you?" He tilted his head, an almost amused expression crossing his face. "But cleverness only gets you so far, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm stayed silent, unwilling to give the officer more fuel, but he felt a surge of anger and frustration building beneath his calm exterior. "I'm just asking to be treated fairly, officer." The officer's expression twisted with contempt. "Fairly?" he echoed, his voice rising. "Fair as me giving you a chance to get out of that car. Now I'm not going to ask again. Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm's heart pounded, but he kept his tone steady. "I'm not stepping out, officer. I've complied with every part of this stop, and unless you have a legal reason..." Before he could finish, the officer's hand shot up, and in one swift motion, he brought his elbow down on the half-rolled window. Glass shattered around Malcolm, sharp fragments hitting his arm and face. He flinched, recoiling as the officer reached in through the broken window, unlocking the door from the inside. The door swung open, and before Malcolm could even react, he felt the officer's hands on him, yanking him out of the seat with brutal force. His feet hit the pavement hard, and his shoulder twisted painfully as the officer forced his arms behind him. "Think you're above following orders, huh?" the officer hissed, his grip unrelenting. "Think you're smarter than me?" Malcolm struggled to stay balanced, his mind racing, disbelief mixing with a growing sense of anger. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "This is excessive, and you know it." The officer tightened his grip on Malcolm's arms, pulling him even closer. "Oh, I know what's excessive, all right," he sneered, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "And you just earned yourself a taste of it." In a swift, practiced motion, the officer snapped handcuffs around Malcolm's wrists, ignoring his protests. The street around them was silent, empty, and Malcolm's world narrowed to the cold bite of metal on his skin and the grim realization that he was at the mercy of a man who had none. With Malcolm restrained, the officer started leading him toward the squad car, leaving the shattered glass and the luxury sedan behind like remnants of a crime scene. Malcolm glanced back at his car, dread pooling in his stomach as he realized just how alone he was. This was only the beginning. The pavement felt rough beneath Malcolm's feet as he stumbled, barely able to keep his balance with his hands cuffed tightly behind him. The officer's grip on his arm was like iron, unyielding and painfully tight. Malcolm tried to pull his shoulder away, but each attempt only made the officer tighten his hold, relishing every sign of resistance. "Stand right here," the officer barked, shoving Malcolm against the side of his squad car. "Since you were so keen to stay put, I thought you'd enjoy the experience up close." Malcolm clenched his jaw, breathing in slowly, fighting the growing sense of dread and anger churning inside him. He forced himself to stay calm, his voice even. "There was no reason for this." "I complied with everything you asked," the officer laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that grated on Malcolm's nerves. "Complied? That's rich. You refused a direct order, and here I thought you business types knew all about compliance." Malcolm met his gaze with a hard stare, refusing to look away. "This isn't compliance. It's harassment, and you know it." The officer's eyes narrowed, the faintest twitch of a scowl tightening his features. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper but dripping with venom. "Harassment? You have no idea, Hayes. The only thing you know about is acting high and mighty." Malcolm forced his jaw to relax, holding his ground. "I've shown you nothing but respect, officer. I've answered every question, provided every document, but it seems that's not enough." "Respect?" The officer took a step back, putting his hands on his hips, his gaze full of cold amusement. "Oh, I don't need your respect, Mr. Hayes. I just need you to learn how to follow orders." Malcolm's patience was fraying fast, but he fought to keep his voice calm, refusing to give the officer what he clearly wanted. "Following orders, or giving you a reason to escalate this?" he asked, his voice edged with barely contained frustration. The officer's smirk grew wider, his gaze flicking over Malcolm with open disdain. "Escalate?" He shook his head, feigning innocence. "Oh, I don't need to escalate anything. You did that the moment you decided you were above the law." Malcolm's eyes flashed with anger. "I didn't decide anything. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." The officer straightened, his face hardening. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, you're just another arrogant punk who thinks he can talk his way out of trouble. Newsflash. You can't." Malcolm could feel the pressure of his own words building up, an urge to shout back, to demand the respect he knew he deserved. But he knew that giving in to that anger would only play into the officer's hands, giving him exactly the excuse he was looking for. So, he took a breath, his voice even and controlled. "Then take me in, if that's what you're so intent on doing. But know that I'll be filing a complaint the moment I get a phone call." The officer's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. "A complaint? Well, by all means. But by the time anyone listens, you'll already be just another case number." He reached for Malcolm's shoulder, shoving him toward the back seat of the squad car. "And don't worry, I'll make sure they have plenty to listen to." As Malcolm was forced into the back of the car, the weight of his situation finally hit him. The officer's words echoed in his mind, and he felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew that once they reached the station, this encounter would be spun into something it wasn't, a story he'd be forced to fight at every turn. The officer slammed the door shut, sealing Malcolm inside. From the back seat, Malcolm watched as the officer headed toward his own car, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Every inch of his body tense with frustration and fear. He knew this was just the beginning. The squad car rolled up to the station, its lights casting an ominous red and blue glow across the quiet parking lot. Malcolm sat in silence, his mind racing with anger, disbelief, and a creeping sense of helplessness. He could feel the tightness in his chest, the tension knotting in his shoulders from the handcuffs digging into his wrists. He had done nothing wrong, but here he was, trapped in a web of lies spun to destroy him. The officer opened the door and yanked him out, gripping his arm with unnecessary force. "Move!" he commanded, his voice devoid of the mock pleasantries he'd used earlier. Malcolm stumbled forward, catching himself before he could trip, his dignity bruised but still intact. Inside, the station was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow across the gray walls and tiled floors. The officer led him to the booking counter, where another officer was waiting, clipboard in hand. The second officer gave Malcolm a quick, indifferent glance before turning to his colleague. "Another one?" the second officer asked, barely looking at Malcolm. The officer who'd arrested him smirked. "Yep, got him on resisting, attempted flight and possession." He spoke the words with a satisfaction that made Malcolm's stomach churn. Malcolm's mouth opened, his instinct to defend himself flaring up, but he forced himself to stay silent. He knew anything he said here would likely be twisted against him. The arresting officer handed over the planted evidence with a smug flourish, the small bag catching the light. "Add it to the inventory," he said, his voice almost casual. The second officer took the bag, jotting down notes without a second glance in Malcolm's direction. He gestured toward the holding cells at the back of the room, motioning for the arresting officer to take Malcolm down the hall. As they walked, Malcolm felt the pressure build within him, the urge to shout, to fight back against the lies that were piling up around him. But he held his tongue, knowing he needed to keep his composure, to keep his mind clear. They reached a cold metal bench in front of the holding cells, where the officer finally unlocked Malcolm's cuffs. "Take a seat," he ordered, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "You'll be here for a while." Malcolm sat down, rubbing his sore wrists, his eyes fixed on the officer with a mixture of defiance and controlled rage. "You can keep twisting this any way you want," he said, his voice low but steady. "But you and I both know what really happened out there." The officer leaned in, hands resting on his hips, his face inches from Malcolm's. "And what are you gonna do about it?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just another file, another case, another suspect who thought he could outsmart the system." Malcolm clenched his fists, fighting the urge to respond with the anger boiling inside him. "This isn't justice, and you know it." The officer shrugged, as if bored. "Justice? That's for the courts to decide. You're just here to sit tight and follow orders." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm alone in the dimly lit holding area. The metal bench was cold and uncomfortable, but Malcolm barely noticed. His mind was racing, the realization of how thoroughly he'd been set up settling heavily on him. Hours passed, and the cold air of the station seemed to seep into his bones. Eventually another officer appeared, unlocking the cell door and gesturing for him to stand. "Interrogation time," the officer said flatly, offering no comfort or encouragement. Malcolm rose, following the officer to a stark, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. He was seated across from a police detective, who entered with a file in hand and a weary look, as though he'd seen 100 cases like this before and expected nothing new. The detective opened the file, skimming the notes before looking up. "Malcolm Hayes," he began, voice neutral. "Says here you were resisting arrest, attempted to flee, and were found in possession. Care to explain?" Malcolm leaned forward, his voice tight with the weight of everything that had led him here. "I was pulled over without cause, harassed by your officer, and he planted that bag in my car. I didn't resist. I was standing up for myself, and now I'm here, because he's made it look like I'm something I'm not." The detective's expression didn't change, his face an unreadable mask. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hayes," he replied, his voice flat. "Why would an officer go through all that trouble?" Malcolm's fists tightened, his frustration palpable. "Because I didn't comply the way he wanted. Because he needed an excuse, a reason to justify what he was doing." The detective glanced back down at the file, his tone unchanging. "I see. And do you have any evidence to support this claim?" Malcolm let out a bitter laugh, the irony stinging. "The only evidence here is what he planted, and we both know that will hold up more than my word ever will." The detective looked at him for a long moment, then closed the file with a sigh. "I've heard it all before, Mr. Hayes. But in this room, what matters is what's on record, and right now, the only thing on record is what Officer Trent reported." He stood up, leaving the file on the table, his face betraying nothing. "You'll get a lawyer and a chance to defend yourself in court, but until then, you're in our custody." The door shut behind him, leaving Malcolm alone in the silent, windowless room. He knew the path ahead would be long, every step a struggle to prove his innocence against a system that seemed designed to break him. But even as the walls seemed to close in around him, He made a silent promise to himself. He would fight. He would not let them erase the truth. This was just the beginning. Malcolm sat alone in his cell, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the stark gray walls. The days since his arrest had stretched out like an endless tunnel, his world reduced to the cold steel bars and the stale scent of concrete. He had spent every night replaying the events, each detail of that awful encounter with the officer etched in his mind, knowing that today was his chance to tell his side of the story. A guard appeared at the cell door, nodding him toward the exit. "You've got visitors again, Hayes." He took a steadying breath and followed the guard out to the small waiting room. As he entered, his eyes immediately found his wife, Layla, who was sitting across from Lisa, his lawyer. Layla's face lit up the moment she saw him, worry and relief mingling in her expression. "Malcolm," she said softly, rising to wrap him in a tight embrace. He closed his eyes, taking in her familiar warmth, the calmness she carried even in moments of crisis. They'd been through so much together, building a life, a family, everything that was now on the line. He pulled back, giving her a small smile. "It's good to see you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Layla kept her hands on his shoulders, her eyes scanning his face. "We're going to get through this, Malcolm. You're not in this alone. Remember that." He nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over him. Sitting beside Layla was Lisa, his lawyer, a determined and skilled attorney who had been working tirelessly on his case. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and composed, with a reputation for fighting for clients who'd been wronged by the system. Since taking on Malcolm's case, Lisa had devoted hours to finding every piece of evidence that could help clear his name. "Lisa," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "Thank you for coming so early." Lisa nodded, her eyes steady as she regarded him. "Of course, Malcolm. This is an important day, and I want you to know what to expect. The prosecutor will be focused on one thing, discrediting you in any way he can." She paused, glancing between Malcolm and Layla. "But we're going to challenge everything he throws at us. I'll make sure the jury hears your side of the story." Layla reached over, taking Malcolm's hand. "Listen to her," she said firmly. "She's been working non-stop. We're going to fight this every step of the way." Malcolm let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, nodding as he absorbed their words. "I know. I keep thinking about how they twisted everything, how they made it look like I was the one in the wrong." His voice was low, laced with frustration. Layla tightened her grip on his hand. "I know it feels like that, but we believe in you, and today we're going to make sure the truth comes out." Lisa leaned forward, her gaze intense. "The jury needs to hear your side, Malcolm. They need to understand that you were calm and compliant, that it was Officer Trent who escalated the situation, not you. That's where we'll focus." The guard reappeared, signaling it was time to enter the courtroom. Layla took a deep breath, her hand lingering on his shoulder. "I'll be right there in the front row. Remember that." Malcolm gave her a nod, feeling her strength steady him as they entered the courtroom. He took his seat beside Lisa, casting a glance over his shoulder to see Layla settling into her spot, her face a mask of quiet determination. The judge entered, and the quiet murmur of the room faded. The prosecutor, a tall, wiry man with a sharp expression, stood up to begin his opening statement. He addressed the jury with practiced confidence, every word meant to paint Malcolm in the worst light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, his voice smooth and clear, "today we will present evidence proving that Mr. Malcolm Hayes resisted a lawful order, attempted to evade Officer Trent, and was found in possession of illegal substances." Malcolm felt his stomach churn as the prosecutor continued, his words twisting reality into a distorted narrative that cast Malcolm as an aggressor. He glanced at the jury, watching the subtle shifts in their expressions as the prosecutor's story took root. Each nod, each sidelong glance felt like a blow, a reminder of how easily the truth could be buried beneath lies. The prosecutor gestured toward Officer Trent, who sat confidently in his uniform. Officer Trent was simply doing his job, conducting a routine traffic stop. But Mr. Hayes escalated the situation, refusing to comply and attempting to flee. This behavior speaks volumes. Malcolm fought to keep his expression neutral, to hide the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. A glance at Layla showed her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the prosecutor with a look of quiet defiance. Then it was Lisa's turn. She rose with calm composure, addressing the jury in a clear, unwavering voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear a very different story. A story that shows not a man resisting arrest, but a man targeted without cause. A man whose rights were stripped away by an officer who acted outside the bounds of the law. She paused, meeting the eyes of each juror. Her voice measured. Mr. Hayes provided his license and registration, followed every legal request made of him. Yet Officer Trent chose to escalate the situation without cause, treating Mr. Hayes not as a citizen, but as a threat. Malcolm felt a faint flicker of hope as he saw a few jurors shift, their faces showing a hint of doubt. He glanced at Layla, seeing pride and determination in her eyes as she followed Lisa's words. But that hope wavered as Officer Trent took the stand. Dressed impeccably in his uniform, his demeanor calm, Trent presented his version of events with a practiced ease. Each word painted Malcolm as an antagonist, a threat that he, as a dedicated officer, had tried to contain. Lisa stood to cross-examine, her questions direct. "Officer Trent, did you have any reasonable cause to suspect Mr. Hayes of criminal activity before initiating the search?" Trent's expression was indifferent, his tone dismissive. His behavior was suspicious. "My job is to ensure the safety of the public." Yet Mr. Hayes provided his license, his registration. "Why, then, did you feel the need to escalate the situation?" Lisa pressed, her gaze steady. "Standard protocol," Trent replied, his voice smooth. "I followed my training." Malcolm's heart sank as he watched the jury's reaction. Trent's words, his calm demeanor, seemed to solidify the prosecutor's narrative. He felt a pang of helplessness as he glanced back at Layla. Her hands were clenched tightly, her face pale, but her eyes still held that fierce, unwavering belief in him. As the trial broke for the day, Lisa gave Malcolm a reassuring nod, though he could see the strain beneath her determined expression. "This isn't over, Malcolm," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "There are more witnesses to call. We're going to keep fighting." Malcolm nodded, his voice steady as he looked back at Layla. "Thank you, Lisa. I know you're doing everything you can." As they left the courtroom, he turned to see Layla waiting for him, her gaze meeting his with a quiet strength that calmed the turmoil within him. She reached for his hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to see this through, Malcolm, whatever it takes." He managed a small smile, her words renewing his resolve. This fight was far from over, and for himself, for his family, and for the woman who stood unwavering beside him, he would see it through to the end. The final day of the trial felt like the close of a nightmare that had swallowed everything Malcolm held dear. As he sat at the defendant's table, hands clasped tightly in front of him, every word spoken seemed to echo with finality. Each phrase from the prosecution, each dismissive glance from the judge, pressed down on him, hardening into an unbearable weight. When the jury filed back in, silence settled over the courtroom. Malcolm's heart pounded as he looked over at Layla, seated in the front row, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with unwavering belief in him, though he could see the strain this ordeal had put on her. The judge's voice broke through the silence. "Will the defendant please rise?" Malcolm stood, his body numb, his thoughts churning as he braced himself. Beside him, Lisa looked up at him with a tight expression, and though she gave him a slight nod, he could see the worry in her eyes. The judge cleared his throat, his face cold and impassive. "In the case of Malcolm Hayes, the jury has found the defendant guilty on all charges." Malcolm's heart sank. Every word that followed felt like a blow, his mind barely able to process the judge's final decree. "This court sentences Mr. Hayes to 100 years in prison." He felt the air leave his lungs, the world around him dimming as the enormity of the sentence settled over him. 100 years. He would never hold Layla again, never watch his children grow, never set foot in his own home. His life was, in an instant, reduced to a cell and the slow, agonizing passage of time. Behind him, Layla let out a strangled sob, her hands flying to her mouth as she fought to keep herself together. He turned to look at her, barely holding back his own tears, the reality hitting him harder than any words could. This sentence didn't just take away his freedom. It took away everything he'd built, everything they'd built together. As the guards moved to take him away, Layla sprang up, rushing to him, her voice choked with grief. "Malcolm, no. This can't be real," she whispered, reaching out to him, her fingers brushing his arm. He swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "I'm sorry, Layla. I didn't think." His voice broke, the words he wanted to say slipping away as he looked into her tear-streaked face. He wanted to tell her he loved her, that he'd find a way to survive this, but the reality was too overwhelming. 100 years meant he'd likely never see freedom again. Layla's eyes blazed with fierce determination, her voice low and full of promise. "I'm not giving up, Malcolm. I swear to you, I'm going to fix this." He managed a faint, sad smile, nodding. "I know you will, Layla. I believe in you." But as the guards pulled him away, her face blurred by his tears, he felt the crushing weight of what he was leaving behind. He thought of their children, their home, the memories they'd made. He thought of Layla going back to that house alone, his absence an ache that neither of them could truly heal. The cold steel doors of the holding cell closed behind him, and in the silence, the implications of his sentence settled like stones in his chest. 100 years meant he'd be an old man, perhaps even gone, by the time he left. He would miss every milestone, every birthday, every moment of his children's lives. He'd miss the small, ordinary moments with Layla, the ones he'd always taken for granted, their quiet mornings, the laughter that filled their home, the life they had built together. As he slumped down onto the hard bench, the thought of his children grew unbearable. His daughter's laugh, his son's pride in him. Everything he'd ever hoped to be for them had been stolen, leaving behind only memories and regret. He would become a name in family stories, a shadow in their lives rather than the father he'd hoped to be. And Layla, she would carry this grief with her, carrying the weight of his absence every day. Time dragged on in the cell, as each hour sharpened the pain of the reality he faced. He could already feel the toll it would take on him. Years of loneliness, the constant ache of memories, and the knowledge that his family would continue on, their lives moving forward while he remained frozen, isolated from everything that had once defined him. But in the midst of his despair, a spark of resilience stirred within him. He held on to Layla's promise, the fire in her eyes as she'd vowed to clear his name. If there was any chance, any hope of freedom, he would have to hold on to it. And if nothing else, he could keep fighting for the family he'd built, even if it meant waiting decades to see justice done. As the hours stretched into the stillness of the night, Malcolm's mind drifted to Layla's words, the fierce determination she'd shown, even as she fought back tears. He knew her. He knew she wouldn't rest until every stone was turned. And maybe, just maybe, that determination would be enough to turn the tide. In the silence of his cell, he clung to that glimmer of hope, his resolve hardening with every passing hour. No matter how long it took, he would hold on. For his children, for the life he'd left behind, and most of all, for Layla. The days following Malcolm's sentencing were filled with a deep, aching silence. Their home felt emptier than ever, the absence of his presence overwhelming. Every corner, every photo reminded Layla of the life they had built together, the life that had been ripped away in a single verdict. As she moved through the house, tending to their children, each task felt hollow, her thoughts always returning to Malcolm and the unimaginable future he faced. Late one night, after putting the children to bed, Layla sat alone in the living room, Malcolm's sentencing still echoing in her mind. She couldn't let this be the end of their story. She had promised him that she wouldn't give up, and now, that promise was all she had left. The next morning, she began her mission. She pulled out a notepad and wrote down every detail she remembered from the trial and Malcolm's arrest, each discrepancy in Officer Trent's testimony, every possible lead. She knew she would need proof, more than just her word. She needed undeniable evidence to challenge the conviction, and she was prepared to go to any lengths to find it. Her first step was to hire a private investigator. After searching for someone reputable and discreet, she found Eric, a professional with a reputation for thoroughness. When they met in his small office, she laid everything out, her voice steady and resolute. "My husband was framed," she began, her gaze unwavering. "The officer who arrested him lied, planted evidence. I need you to find proof, any proof, that can show what really happened." Eric listened carefully, his expression serious. "I'll start by looking at the scene of the arrest," he said, jotting down notes. "I'll check for nearby security cameras, any possible witnesses. Sometimes evidence turns up in the least expected places." "Thank you," Layla replied, her voice thick with gratitude and determination. "Please, I just need something that can prove his innocence." In the days that followed, Layla balanced her responsibilities at home with her mission to clear Malcolm's name. She spent long hours poring over court records, police reports, and anything that could provide a lead. She was relentless, driven by the promise she had made to Malcolm and the knowledge that his future depended on her. One evening, just as she was beginning to lose hope, her phone rang. It was Eric. "Layla, I found something," he said, his voice urgent. "There's a nearby store's security camera that captured part of the encounter. I think you'll want to see this." Her heart raced as she met him the next day, watching the grainy footage in his office. Her hands tightened on the chair as she watched Officer Trent approach Malcolm's car, lean in, and then, in a moment that took her breath away, pull a small bag from his own pocket and slip it under Malcolm's seat. She felt a surge of relief and fury all at once. This was it, the proof she had been praying for. Eric paused the footage, his expression grim. "This is the evidence you need. With this, you can challenge the conviction, but honestly, Layla, this needs to go public." Layla nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Eric. You have no idea what this means. I want everyone to see this." Her next step was to contact Lisa, Malcolm's lawyer. She met with her early the following morning, showing her the footage. Lisa's eyes widened as she watched, her expression hardening. "This is a game changer, Layla. We can file for an appeal immediately. And if we go public with this, it could put pressure on the department to act." Layla took a deep breath, thinking of the promise she'd made to Malcolm. "Let's go public. I want the world to see what happened." With Lisa's help, Layla reached out to journalists, sharing the footage and telling Malcolm's story. The video began to spread across social media, each clip fueling outrage over the blatant injustice. Within hours, and justice for Malcolm and the end police corruption were trending as people shared messages of support and demanded accountability for Officer Trent's actions. News outlets picked up the story, running segments that showcased the footage, and protests began gathering outside the courthouse. People held signs that read, "Free Malcolm Hayes" and "Hold Officer Trent accountable," joining together in solidarity with Layla and her fight for justice. As the movement gained momentum, the pressure became impossible for the authorities to ignore. The police department announced an internal investigation into Trent's conduct, and soon he was suspended. Within days, the appeals process for Malcolm's case was expedited, and for the first time it seemed like justice might finally be within reach. For the first time since his sentencing, Layla felt hope. The fight was far from over, but the truth was out there now, and Malcolm's voice was no longer silenced. She would see this battle through to the end. For Malcolm, for their family, and for every person who had been unjustly silenced. This was only the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. As the evidence of Officer Trent's corruption spread, the response was immediate and powerful. News stations replayed the damning footage of Trent planting evidence, and Malcolm's case became a rallying cry for reform. People from all walks of life stood in solidarity, demanding justice for Malcolm and accountability for those who had wronged him. Layla felt the energy of the movement bolstering her resolve. But as the public's support grew, so did the scrutiny and backlash from certain quarters. Her phone constantly buzzed with messages of support, but there were also those who defended Trent and questioned Malcolm's innocence. Still, she focused on the goal, clearing Malcolm's name and bringing him home. Lisa worked tirelessly to expedite the appeal. "This evidence changes everything, Layla," she explained, poring over case files with renewed determination. "But we still need to be careful. The court system can be slow, and the opposition will try to poke holes in anything they can. But with the footage, we're starting from a strong position." Layla nodded, absorbing each word, her thoughts always returning to Malcolm. They hadn't been able to see each other since the public release of the video, and she worried about how he was holding up. Despite the weight of the public pressure, it still felt like justice moved at a glacial pace, and every day without him only deepened her resolve. Finally, after weeks of procedural filings and intensive work, the appeal date was set. The hearing would determine whether the new evidence was sufficient to overturn the conviction and grant Malcolm a retrial. The day of the hearing, Layla arrived at the courthouse early, her heart pounding with both anxiety and hope. Supporters lined the steps outside, holding signs and chanting for Malcolm's release. She passed them with a small nod, grateful for their presence. But her focus remained on the courtroom doors ahead. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Lisa sat beside her, her expression focused, as they waited for Malcolm to enter. When he finally appeared, led by guards to the defendant's table, Layla felt a rush of emotion, her breath catching as she saw him for the first time in weeks. Malcolm's face was weary, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But as he looked around the room and saw her, a faint smile softened his expression. As the hearing began, Lisa presented the new evidence with a calm yet powerful argument. She played the footage of Trent's actions during the arrest, detailing each movement and explaining how it completely contradicted the original narrative that had led to Malcolm's conviction. "This video evidence clearly demonstrates Officer Trent's misconduct," Lisa argued, her voice clear and confident. "My client was targeted, his rights violated, and his innocence manipulated to fit a false narrative. We respectfully ask the court to overturn this conviction and grant Mr. Hayes a fair trial based on the truth." The opposing counsel tried to cast doubt on the video, questioning its authenticity and attempting to discredit Eric, the investigator who had uncovered it. But Lisa countered each point with a fierce precision, refocusing the court's attention on the facts. As Lisa made her closing statement, she turned to the judge, her expression earnest. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just one man's life. It's about accountability and the integrity of our justice system. Malcolm Hayes deserves his freedom and a chance to rebuild his life. He deserves justice." The judge called a brief recess before announcing the decision. As everyone filed out into the hallway, Layla joined Malcolm, her hand finding his, gripping tightly. "Malcolm," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We're almost there." He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Layla, for everything. I wouldn't have survived this without you." After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned to deliver his ruling. The courtroom fell silent as he addressed the assembly. After reviewing the new evidence presented, it is clear that serious misconduct occurred in the original proceedings. This court finds that Malcolm Hayes was denied a fair trial and therefore overturns his conviction. Mr. Hayes will be granted a retrial. A ripple of relief spread through the room, and Layla felt tears spring to her eyes as Malcolm's hand tightened around hers. Though the retrial still loomed ahead, they had won a crucial victory, a step closer to bringing Malcolm home for good. As they walked out of the courthouse together, the crowd erupted in cheers, surrounding them with warmth and support. Layla looked up at Malcolm, her heart full, knowing they still had a battle to fight, but finally feeling hope. The journey was far from over, but they would face it together. Malcolm's retrial had become a national event, with media coverage detailing every development. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters, journalists, and activists, all demanding justice not only for Malcolm, but also for accountability for Officer Trent. The officer's face had been broadcast everywhere, his actions scrutinized and condemned by a public that now saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. Inside the courtroom, Malcolm sat beside Lisa, his shoulders tense but his gaze focused. This time he wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was facing down the man who had taken it from him. Across the room sat Officer Trent, his face carefully neutral, though he occasionally shifted uncomfortably under the watchful eyes of the jury. Lisa opened with a powerful statement. "This retrial is not just about clearing Malcolm Hayes' name, it's about revealing the truth. We're here to expose Officer Trent's abuse of power and how he manipulated evidence to build a case against an innocent man." When it was the prosecution's turn, they called Officer Trent to testify, hoping to recover some semblance of credibility. Trent took the stand with a forced calm, his eyes scanning the room, aware that every word he spoke was being scrutinized. His once certain demeanor was now marked with a subtle unease as he recounted the events leading to Malcolm's arrest, omitting key details and carefully skirting around his own actions. Lisa watched him intently, waiting until the prosecution had finished before standing for cross-examination. Her voice was steady, her questions precise. "Officer Trent," she began, "on the day of Mr. Hayes' arrest, did you have any concrete evidence that he was involved in criminal activity before you approached his vehicle?" Trent's expression tightened, his gaze shifting briefly. "His behavior was suspicious," he replied, his tone defensive. "As an officer, it's my duty to investigate anything that seems out of the ordinary." Lisa's gaze remained steady. "And yet, Mr. Hayes provided his license, his registration, and complied with your requests. Why then did you escalate the situation?" Trent's mouth thinned, his tone growing colder. "Sometimes you have to follow your instincts." Lisa paused, her voice calm but firm as she continued. "You mean to say you followed your instincts by placing a bag under Mr. Hayes' seat and claiming it as evidence?" She gestured toward the video monitor, where the damning footage played again, showing Trent's incriminating actions. The courtroom fell silent as the video showed Trent's hand slipping the small bag beneath Malcolm's seat. Trent's face reddened, his gaze shifting away from the screen. Lisa continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "Officer Trent, do you have an explanation for this footage? For planting false evidence and fabricating a crime?" Trent's voice faltered, his once confident tone reduced to a mumble. I was just doing my job." He resisted, and I had to ensure public safety. Lisa's voice rose, filled with the intensity of months of preparation. "Public safety? Or your own agenda?" She turned to the jury. "This man abused his power, betraying his oath and compromising justice for personal prejudice. Malcolm Hayes did not break the law. Officer Trent did." As Lisa finished, she returned to her seat beside Malcolm, her expression firm and resolute. Malcolm felt a surge of gratitude toward her, a sense that for the first time, his voice had been heard in a court that once refused to listen. The prosecution's closing arguments were shaky and defensive, their case weakened beyond repair. As the jury deliberated, Malcolm joined Layla in the hallway, their hands entwined as they waited in silence, the hope in her eyes mirroring his own. When the jury returned, the judge called the courtroom to order, and Malcolm stood, his heart pounding as he awaited their decision. The foreman cleared his throat, glancing at Malcolm. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Malcolm Hayes, not guilty on all charges." A wave of relief swept through the room. Malcolm felt the weight of the past year lift as he embraced Layla, his gratitude and joy overwhelming as cheers erupted from supporters. Outside, the crowd gathered to celebrate Malcolm's exoneration and demand justice for the lives disrupted by corrupt officers like Trent. Reporters surrounded him, eager to hear his thoughts. Malcolm looked into the cameras, his voice clear and steady. "This wasn't just a fight for me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It was a fight for everyone who has been wronged by a system that fails to protect its own people. This is a victory, but there is more work to be done." As he spoke, Officer Trent was quietly led out of the courthouse, the weight of his actions and the legal consequences they carried settling over him. He had gone from a respected officer to a man facing his own trial for perjury, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. Malcolm and Layla walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, into the light of a new chapter. Their lives, once shattered, were ready to be rebuilt. Together, they were finally free to start anew. The weeks after Malcolm's exoneration were filled with a whirlwind of media attention and public support. But even as Malcolm and Layla began rebuilding their lives, a new chapter was unfolding in the courthouse. This time with Officer Trent in the defendant's seat. The weight of his actions, brought to light by Malcolm's retrial, had sparked an investigation, and now he faced his own trial for perjury, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. The trial was another high-profile case, drawing attention from the same supporters who had rallied for Malcolm's freedom. Crowds filled the steps outside the courthouse, chanting for justice and holding signs that read, "End police corruption," and "Accountability for all." The atmosphere was charged as the public demanded answers for the injustices that had nearly destroyed Malcolm's life. Inside, Trent sat at the defense table, looking a shadow of his former self. Gone was the confident, composed officer who had testified against Malcolm. In his place sat a man weighed down by the consequences of his actions, his reputation in ruins, his life irrevocably changed. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time in painting a clear picture of Trent's abuse of power. Witness after witness testified, detailing a pattern of behavior that pointed to a man who had used his position to target individuals based on prejudice rather than any actual threat. Malcolm attended every day of the trial, sitting with Layla in the gallery, watching as the story of Trent's corruption unfolded. He felt a mixture of anger and satisfaction as he listened to the testimonies, each one confirming what he had known all along, that Trent's actions were deliberate, his corruption systemic. On the second day, the prosecutor presented the video footage as evidence, the same damning clip that had been used to free Malcolm. The jury watched in silence as the footage played, the image of Trent's hand slipping the small bag into Malcolm's car seat forever captured in digital clarity. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This footage speaks for itself. Officer Trent betrayed the badge he wore, using his authority not to protect, but to condemn. His actions stripped an innocent man of his freedom, his family, and nearly his life." Trent's lawyer attempted to mount a defense, claiming that his actions had been misinterpreted, that he had acted under pressure and in line with standard protocol. but the evidence was overwhelming, and each witness further weakened the defense's case. When Trent took the stand, he was visibly nervous, his confidence shattered. Gone was the calculated testimony he had given during Malcolm's trial. This time his answers were filled with hesitations and contradictions. "Officer Trent," the prosecutor began, his voice cold and clear, "you planted evidence in Mr. Hayes's car. You lied under oath. Do you understand the weight of what you've done?" Trent shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. I thought he was a threat. I acted on instinct," he mumbled, though his voice held little conviction. "Instinct?" the prosecutor pressed, leaning closer. "Or was it bias? Prejudice? The desire to prove something at the expense of an innocent man's life?" Trent's silence was answer enough. He looked defeated, the weight of his actions finally sinking in as he sat under the harsh scrutiny of the court. The trial concluded quickly, with the jury taking little time to deliberate. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction. Trent was sentenced to a prison term of 15 years for his crimes, a sentence that was as much symbolic as it was punitive, meant to send a message that no one was above accountability. As the guards led Trent away, Malcolm and Layla watched in silence. Trent glanced back once, his face pale and defeated, his expression one of regret mixed with anger. But Malcolm felt no satisfaction in Trent's fall. Instead, he felt a deep sense of closure, a reminder that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Months later, Malcolm and Layla found themselves in a new chapter of life. The media frenzy had died down, and their family was slowly beginning to heal. They returned to their routines, building their future together with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat on their porch, Malcolm looked out over the quiet street, his hand resting over Layla's. "We've been through so much," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I can't believe we finally have peace." Layla squeezed his hand, smiling. "It's not over, Malcolm. There's more work to do. But we have each other, and that's enough." Together, they embraced the life they had fought so hard to rebuild, their love and resilience a testament to their strength. They knew the scars of the past would remain, but they would face them together, moving forward with a renewed commitment to justice, love, and truth. And in a distant prison cell, Officer Trent faced his own reflection, left with the memory of a life shaped by choices he could never